Imagine being 20 years old and inheriting a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Now imagine that within 13 years, you've conquered the known world, defeated armies 5 times your size, and created an empire stretching from Greece to India. This isn't fantasy. This is the true story of Alexander the Great, a man who died at 32 but whose legend has lived for over 2,000 years. But here's what they don't tell you in history books. Alexander might have been murdered. His final days were shrouded in mystery, filled with bizarre symptoms that modern scientists still debate. Was it poison, disease, or something even stranger? Today, we're diving deep into the life of history's most audacious conqueror. We'll explore the secrets his mother whispered to him as a child, the moment he tamed a horse no one else could ride, his mysterious relationship with his best friend Hephaestion, and the night he burned down one of the ancient world's greatest cities, possibly while drunk. This is the story of Alexander the Great, but not the sanitized version. This is the raw, bloody, brilliant, and sometimes terrifying truth about the young king who conquered the world. Let's start with a scene that would define Alexander's entire life. It's 344 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon. A horse dealer has brought a magnificent stallion to King Philip II, Alexander's father. This horse, named Bucephalus, is stunning, jet black with a white star on his forehead. But there's a problem. He's completely wild. Every experienced horseman has tried to ride him, and every single one has been thrown off violently. Philip is about to send the horse away when his 13-year-old son speaks up. "Father, you're about to lose an excellent horse because these men are too ignorant and cowardly to handle him." Philip is not amused. "Are you criticizing these men because you think you can do better?" "I can certainly handle this horse better than they can," Alexander replies. The crowd laughs. But Philip sees something in his son's eyes, that same fierce determination he's seen before. "And if you fail?" Philip asks. "I'll pay for the horse myself, 13 talents. That's an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. For a 13-year-old to make such a bet is either brilliant or insane. Alexander approaches Bucephalus carefully. He's noticed something no one else has. The horse is terrified of his own shadow. Alexander gently turns the horse toward the sun, so his shadow falls behind him. He speaks softly, strokes the horse's neck, and then, in one fluid motion, leaps onto his back. The crowd holds its breath. But instead of bucking, Bucephalus responds to Alexander's confidence. Boy and horse ride together across the field, moving as one. When Alexander returns, his father has tears in his eyes. "My son," Philip says, "you must find a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small." This wasn't just about a horse. This was about observation, courage, and the absolute self-belief that would carry Alexander across the known world. But where did this confidence come from? To understand that, we need to talk about his mother, and she was possibly more terrifying than Alexander himself. Olympias was a princess from Epirus, a region known for its fierce mountain warriors and strange religious practices. She was a devotee of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, and reportedly participated in secret ceremonies involving snakes and wild dancing. The historian Plutarch wrote that Philip once found Olympias sleeping with a serpent coiled beside her in bed. Whether this was literal or metaphorical, it terrified Philip and may have contributed to their later estrangement. But for young Alexander, these stories had a different purpose. Olympias whispered a secret to her son, one that would define his entire worldview. "You are not your father's son. Your true father is Zeus, king of the gods." Now, was this true? Of course not. But did Olympias believe it? Quite possibly. And did Alexander believe it? That's the fascinating question. Because Alexander acted as if he believed it, or at least found it useful to have others believe it. This wasn't just maternal ambition. This was psychological warfare. Olympias was preparing her son not just to rule, but to transcend normal human limitations. She told him stories of his ancestor Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. She commissioned the philosopher Aristotle to tutor him, giving Alexander access to knowledge that would shape Western civilization. But Olympias was also ruthless. When Philip took another wife, Cleopatra, a Macedonian noblewoman, Olympia saw it as both a personal betrayal and a threat to Alexander's succession. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle stood and made a toast. Now perhaps we'll have a legitimate heir to the throne. Alexander exploded. He threw his cup at the man and shouted, "Am I a bastard, then?" Philip, drunk, drew his sword and lunged at his own son, but stumbled and fell. Alexander looked at his father on the ground and said coldly, "Here's the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he can't even cross from one couch to another." Mother and son fled that night to Epirus. This exile didn't last long, but revealed the toxic dynamics of the royal family. Philip needed Alexander. He was his most capable commander, but the tension between father and son would never fully heal. And then, in 336 BC, something happened that changed everything. The scene is a theater in Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedon. Philip II is celebrating the marriage of his daughter with elaborate games and festivities. He's at the height of his power. He's unified Greece under his control and is planning an invasion of Persia, the mightiest empire on earth. Philip enters the theater, walking ahead of his bodyguards to show he has nothing to fear from his own people. It's a display of confidence and power. Then a man named Pausanias, one of Philip's own bodyguards, rushes forward and stabs the king through the ribs. Philip dies almost instantly. Pausanias runs for horses waiting outside, but he's caught and killed before he can escape or explain his motives. Convenient, isn't it? The official story is that Pausanias had a personal grievance against Philip. Years earlier, he'd been sexually assaulted by one of Philip's friends, and when he complained, Philip did nothing. This humiliation festered until Pausanias snapped. But many historians, both ancient and modern, suspect a conspiracy. And the primary suspects? Olympias and Alexander. Consider the evidence. Olympias had every reason to hate Philip. He'd humiliated her by taking a new wife. Alexander's succession was potentially threatened by any children Philip might have with his new wife. And most suspiciously, Olympias later honored Pausanias' tomb and had Philip's newest wife and her infant daughter murdered shortly after Philip's death. Did Alexander know about the assassination beforehand? We'll never know for certain, but he benefited enormously from it. At 20 years old, Alexander became king of Macedon. Most people assumed the young king would be a pushover. His father had been a military genius who transformed Macedon from a backwater into a superpower. What could a 20-year-old boy possibly do? They were about to find out. Alexander's first challenge came immediately. The Greek city-states, which Philip had forcibly brought under Macedonian control, saw the young king's accession as an opportunity to rebel. Thebes, one of Greece's most powerful cities, rose in revolt. A more cautious ruler might have negotiated or offered concessions. Alexander marched south with his army. When he arrived at Thebes, he gave the citizens a choice: surrender peacefully or face destruction. The Thebans, confident in their legendary military tradition, chose to fight. It was a massacre. Alexander's army broke through the walls and flooded into the city. But what happened next shocked the ancient world. Alexander ordered Thebes to be completely destroyed, not just defeated, erased. 6,000 Thebans were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. Every building was burned to the ground except for the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired. Why such brutality from a king who'd been tutored by Aristotle, who'd read Homer and claimed to value Greek culture? Because Alexander was sending a message: I am not my father. I am more dangerous. Obey me or cease to exist. It worked. Every other Greek city immediately submitted. No one else dared rebel. But even as he established his power in Greece, Alexander's eyes were on a far greater prize: Persia. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. According to legend, he was the first to leap from his ship onto Asian soil. He threw a spear into the ground and declared that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. His army numbered about 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a formidable force, but tiny compared to what awaited him. The Persian Empire controlled territory from Egypt to India. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its treasury was virtually limitless. Alexander had no real plan for conquering all of it. He had no supply lines back to Macedonia. What he had was audacity and a willingness to risk everything on a single battle. That battle came at the Granicus River. The Persian commanders had positioned their cavalry on the near bank, expecting to slaughter the Macedonians as they emerged from the water. It was a strong defensive position. Alexander's generals advised caution. Wait for a better opportunity, they urged. The river is too deep, the bank's too steep. Alexander's response? I would be ashamed if, after crossing the Hellespont so easily, this little stream should stop us. He led the charge personally, plunging into the river on Persepolis. The Persians focused their entire attack on Alexander, recognizing him by his distinctive armor and the white plumes on his helmet. A Persian noble struck Alexander's helmet so hard it split in two. Another raised a sword for a killing blow, but Alexander's friend Clitus cut off the man's arm, saving the king's life. The Macedonians broke through and routed the Persian cavalry. It was an impossible victory, but it was only the first of many. As Alexander marched through Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities from Persian control, his legend grew, but so did the risks. Because waiting for him, assembling an army so large it defied comprehension, was Darius III, the great king of Persia himself. It's the evening before the Battle of Issus, 333 BCE. Alexander's scouts have reported that Darius has personally arrived with an army estimated at over 100,000 men, perhaps 200,000. The Persians outnumber the Macedonians by at least 5 to 1. Alexander's generals are nervous. Some suggest retreating to better ground. Others worry openly about fighting such overwhelming numbers. Alexander calls a meeting of his commanders. He doesn't give them a stirring speech about glory or duty. Instead, he analyzes the situation like a chess master. Darius has made a mistake, Alexander explains. He's chosen to fight in this narrow coastal plain where he can't use his superior numbers effectively. His massive army will get in its own way. And more importantly, Darius himself will be there, in the center of his line. What does that matter? Someone asks. Everything, Alexander responds. Persian armies don't fight for Persia. They fight for their king. If Darius falls, or even if he runs, his entire army will collapse. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to kill or capture Darius himself. The Battle of Issus began with a calculated gamble that would have terrified any reasonable commander. As the armies formed up, Alexander did something unexpected. While his left wing held defensively and his center engaged the Persian infantry, Alexander personally led his elite companion cavalry in an oblique charge, not at the Persian flanks, but straight toward the center, where Darius commanded from a ceremonial chariot. Picture this moment. Alexander, at 22 years old, leading a wedge of cavalry directly toward an enemy force 5 times the size. The Persians must have thought he was insane, charging into the heart of their army like a spear thrust into a chest. But Alexander had studied Persian tactics. He knew that the great king's guard, while numerous, were not trained to handle a concentrated cavalry assault. They were ceremonial troops, more symbol than substance. The companion cavalry smashed through the Persian lines like a hammer through glass. Alexander himself killed Persian nobles with his sarissa, the long Macedonian pike. Ancient sources say his arm grew tired from killing, and then Darius saw him coming. The great king of Persia, ruler of the largest empire on earth, panicked. With Alexander's cavalry less than 50 yards away and cutting down his guards, Darius made a decision that would echo through history. He fled. He abandoned his chariot, mounted a horse, and rode for his life. The moment Darius ran, his army collapsed. Persian soldiers who moments before had been fighting fiercely suddenly looked around, saw their king fleeing, and joined the rout. An orderly battle became a massacre as the Persians trampled each other trying to escape. Alexander pursued, but couldn't catch Darius. However, he captured something almost as valuable, the Persian royal camp. When Alexander entered Darius's captured tent that evening, he stepped into a different world. The tent was more luxurious than most palaces. Golden furniture, silk draperies, exotic perfumes. The wealth on display was staggering. But more importantly, Alexander found Darius's mother, wife, and 2 daughters, who'd been traveling with the Persian army. The women were terrified. In ancient warfare, female captives of defeated armies faced predictable and horrific fates. Darius's mother, Sisygambes, prostrated herself before Alexander, begging for mercy. What Alexander did next shocked his own men. He raised Sisygambes to her feet and said, "Mother, you have not mistaken your man." This man, too, was Alexander. He declared that the women would be treated as royal guests, not prisoners. Darius's daughters would be educated, not enslaved. His wife would maintain her dignity and title. And he began addressing Sisygambes as mother, a title he would use for the rest of his life. Why this unexpected mercy? Multiple reasons. First, it was brilliant propaganda, showing the Persians that Alexander could be a better king than Darius. Second, it demonstrated that Alexander saw himself as the rightful successor to Persian rule, not just a foreign invader. Third, and perhaps most telling, it revealed something about Alexander's character that modern historians often overlook. Alexander genuinely admired Persian culture. Unlike most Greeks, who viewed Persians as barbarians, Alexander recognized the sophistication of Persian civilization. He began wearing elements of Persian dress. He adopted Persian court ceremonies. He even started planning to integrate Persians into his administration and army. This would later cause enormous problems with his Macedonian veterans, who felt betrayed. But for now, this policy of cultural fusion, which historians call syncretism, was revolutionary. Darius, from his refuge deep in Persia, sent Alexander a letter offering terms. Alexander could keep all Persian territory west of the Euphrates River, plus 30,000 talent of gold, and marry one of Darius's daughters, cementing an alliance. Alexander's general Parmenion said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept these terms." Alexander's reply was legendary. "If I were Parmenion, so would I." He sent a message back to Darius. "Come to me and ask for your mother, your wife, and your children. Ask properly, addressing me as the king of Asia, and you'll receive them. But send me as to an equal again, and I will deal with you as with a criminal. If you wish to dispute your right to the kingdom, stand your ground and fight. Don't run away. I will find you wherever you go." It was more than arrogance. Alexander was forcing Darius to accept a new reality. There was only one king in Asia now, and it wasn't the Persian. But before he could pursue Darius deeper into Persia, Alexander had to secure his flanks. And that meant conquering 2 of the ancient world's most formidable cities, Tyre and Gaza. Tyre was considered impregnable. The city sat on an island half a mile from shore, surrounded by walls 150 feet high. It had never been taken by siege. The Tyrians told Alexander, "Go ahead and rule Asia, just leave us alone." Alexander couldn't accept that. Any city that refused him challenged his entire narrative of inevitability. So Alexander decided to do something that seemed crazy. He would build a causeway, a bridge of earth and stone, from the mainland to the island city. His engineers thought he was mad. Building a causeway half a mile long in open water, while under attack from Tyrian ships, was an engineering nightmare. But Alexander was relentless. He set his entire army to work hauling rocks, timber, and earth. Day after day, the causeway grew. The Tyrians sent fire ships to burn the wooden structures. Alexander rebuilt them with stone. The Tyrians sent divers to sabotage the foundations. Alexander posted guards underwater. This went on for 7 months. The Tyrians began to believe their city might actually fall. In desperation, they massacred Macedonian prisoners on their walls, within sight of Alexander's army. It was a fatal mistake. When the causeway finally reached Tyre's walls, Alexander brought up siege towers and battering rams. His navy, assembled from conquered cities, blockaded the harbor, and then in a coordinated assault, the Macedonians broke through. What followed was one of ancient history's bloodiest sackings. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting. 30,000 were sold into slavery. 2,000 military-age men were crucified along the coast, a message to any other city considering resistance. The causeways Alexander built still exist today, permanently connecting Tyre to the mainland. Where once there was an island, now there's a peninsula literal proof of Alexander's while reshaping geography itself. But even this triumph was about to be eclipsed by what awaited in Egypt. When Alexander marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, he found a country eager to welcome him. The Egyptians had hated Persian rule, and Alexander positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. But Alexander wasn't satisfied with just political control of Egypt. He wanted something more: spiritual legitimacy. He announced his intention to visit the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert. His generals thought this was an unnecessary risk. The journey through the desert was treacherous, and Alexander would be far from his army. But Alexander insisted. The Oracle of Siwa was one of the ancient world's most sacred sites, and the priests were said to speak directly for the god Ammonius, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. The journey almost killed him. Plutarch writes that Alexander's party got lost in the desert, with sandstorms erasing their tracks. According to legend, they were saved by ravens that guided them to the oasis. What happened inside the oracle's sanctuary remains one of history's great mysteries. The priest spoke only to Alexander, and he never revealed exactly what was said. But when he emerged, he announced that the oracle had confirmed what he'd always suspected. He was the son of Zeus Ammonius, a living god. Was this true? Did the priests actually say this? Or did Alexander simply claim they did? We'll never know. But here's what matters. From this point forward, Alexander demanded to be worshipped as divine. He ordered Greek cities to establish cults in his honor. He expected his subjects to perform proskynesis, the Persian practice of bowing to the ground before the king. His Macedonian veterans hated this. They'd followed Alexander as a brilliant general and king, but they refused to worship him as a god. This tension would eventually lead to violence within Alexander's inner circle. But first, Alexander had unfinished business. Darius was assembling another army, even larger than before. And this time, the Persian king was determined not to run. The final confrontation between Alexander and Darius would take place at Gaugamela, and it would be the largest battle of the ancient world. October 1st, 331 BCE, the plains of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia. Darius had learned from his previous defeats. This time, he'd chosen the battlefield carefully, a vast, flat plain where his superior numbers could be fully deployed. He'd even had his engineers level the ground to facilitate his side chariots, war chariots with blades extending from the wheels, designed to cut through enemy infantry formations. The numbers were staggering. Modern historians estimate Darius had between 100,000 and 250,000 troops. Alexander had perhaps 47,000. The Persians outnumbered the Macedonians by at least 3-1, possibly 5-1. On the night before battle, Alexander's generals expected him to be planning tactics. Instead, they found him sleeping soundly. They had to wake him up. "How can you sleep?" Parmenion asked. Alexander smiled. "Before, I couldn't sleep because Darius kept running away. Now he's finally standing a fight. Why wouldn't I sleep peacefully?" But when battle was joined, Alexander revealed a tactical brilliance that military academies still study today. As the Persian cavalry charged, Alexander refused to meet them head-on. Instead, he began moving his entire army diagonally toward the edge of the prepared battlefield. Darius's commanders had to shift to match him, stretching their lines thinner and thinner. The Persian side chariots charged, but Alexander's light infantry simply opened their ranks and let the chariots through, pelting them with javelins. The feared superweapon was neutralized, and then Alexander saw it. As the Persian left wing pursued his right, a gap opened in the Persian center, right next to where Darius commanded. Alexander didn't hesitate. He personally led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation, driving straight for that gap. The formation was called the hammer and anvil. The cavalry was a hammer, smashing the enemy against the anvil of the infantry phalanx. For the second time, Alexander came within killing distance of Darius. Persian guards died trying to protect their king. Alexander's sarissa dripped with blood, and for the second time, Darius broke and ran. But this time, things went wrong. While Alexander pursued Darius, the Persian right wing broke through the Macedonian left, which was commanded by Parmenion. Persian cavalry actually reached Alexander's camp and began looting it. Parmenion sent a desperate message. We need reinforcements immediately or we'll be destroyed. Alexander faced an agonizing choice. Continue pursuing Darius and end the war, or turn back to save his army. He chose his army. He wheeled his cavalry around and smashed into the Persian cavalry from behind. The Persians, caught between Alexander's cavalry and the reformed Macedonian infantry, were annihilated, but Darius escaped again. Still, Gaugamela was a death blow to the Persian Empire. Darius fled east, his authority shattered. Persian nobles began surrendering their cities to Alexander without a fight. Within weeks, Alexander had captured Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the richest cities in the world. Persepolis was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, a city of unimaginable splendor. When Alexander's army entered it in 330 BCE, they found treasures beyond counting. Ancient sources claim Alexander needed 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to transport the gold and silver. For months, Alexander occupied Persepolis peacefully. He respected Persian customs, protected Persian nobles who surrendered, and presented himself as the rightful successor to the Persian throne rather than a foreign conqueror. And then, one night, something snapped. The ancient sources give us conflicting accounts of what happened that night in Persepolis, but the most dramatic version comes from several historians who claim to have interviewed people who were there. Alexander was hosting a drinking party, a symposium in Greek style. Wine flowed freely. Among the guests was a courtesan named Thais, who was a companion of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted generals. Thais was educated, witty, and bold, not the kind of woman to remain silent when men were drinking and talking. As the wine loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, Thais stood up and delivered a speech. She reminded everyone that Persepolis had been the capital of the empire that burned Athens during the Persian Wars, 150 years earlier. Every Greek child learned about that sacrilege. She suggested, perhaps jokingly at first, that it would be fitting if a woman, an Athenian woman, led the burning of Persepolis in revenge. The drunk Macedonians roared approval. Someone grabbed a torch. Alexander, intoxicated and caught up in the moment, seized another torch and led a procession to the great palace of Xerxes. They set it ablaze. The palace of Persepolis, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, began to burn. The flames illuminated the night sky. The heat was so intense that people could feel it from miles away. And then, according to some sources, Alexander sobered up, looking at the inferno he created. Alexander reportedly felt immediate regret. This wasn't who he wanted to be. He'd spent months positioning himself as a legitimate Persian king, showing respect for Persian culture and traditions. And in one drunken night, he destroyed the symbolic heart of the empire he claimed to rule. The next morning, Alexander looked at the ruins and ordered the fires extinguished, but it was too late. Portions of the palace were gone forever. Modern archaeologists have found evidence supporting this account. The burn pattern suggests a rapid, uncontrolled fire, not a systematic demolition. In the ruins, they found luxury items that would have been looted if this had been a planned destruction. But whether it was drunken impulse or calculated revenge, the burning of Persepolis sent a message. Alexander was still capable of terrible wrath. The cities that had welcomed him peacefully had made the right choice. Yet even as Alexander secured control of the Persian heartland, Darius remained at large, still technically the great king, still a rallying point for Persian resistance. Alexander couldn't truly claim to rule Persia while Darius lived, so he pursued his rival deeper and deeper into the eastern provinces of the empire. In the summer of 330 BCE, Alexander's scouts brought news. Darius was fleeing eastward with a remnant of his army, trying to reach the eastern satrapies provinces, where he might rebuild his forces. Alexander launched a lightning pursuit. He drove his men mercilessly, covering incredible distances each day. Many soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Alexander kept pushing. Finally, Alexander's advance guard caught up with the Persian column. But something was wrong. There was no organized army, just a few hundred men surrounding wagons. And in one of those wagons, they found Darius. He'd been stabbed multiple times. The men who'd killed him were his own nobles, Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, along with several other Persian commanders. Facing the choice between certain defeat under Darius and possible favor from Alexander, they'd chosen betrayal. They'd murdered their king and fled. According to tradition, Darius was still barely alive when Alexander's soldiers found him. He asked for water, and when a Macedonian soldier gave him a drink, Darius thanked him and said, "Tell Alexander. Tell him I'm grateful for his kindness to my mother and family. Tell him he has been more loyal to me than my own subjects." Then he died. When Alexander arrived moments later and saw Darius's body, he wept. Whether from genuine emotion or political theater, we can't know, but his actions afterward suggest real grief. He ordered Darius buried with full royal honors in the Persian royal tombs. He declared Bessus and the other assassins criminals to be hunted down and executed for regicide. And he made a subtle but crucial claim. By murdering Darius, the Persian nobles had committed treason not just against their king, but against Alexander, because Alexander was now the rightful king of Asia, and Darius had been his deputy. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda. Alexander wasn't a foreign invader who defeated Persia. He was a legitimate ruler who'd stepped in when the previous king proved inadequate, and who now had a duty to punish those who betrayed the crown. Most Persian nobles accepted this logic and submitted to Alexander's rule. But Bessus didn't. He fled to Bactria, in what's now Afghanistan, declared himself the new great king, and prepared to resist. Alexander's reaction was immediate and furious. He would pursue Bessus to the ends of the earth. And that's exactly what he did, literally. For the next 3 years, from 330 to 327 BC, Alexander led his army through some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. They crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains in winter. They fought in the deserts of Central Asia. They besieged mountain fortresses thought to be impregnable. And slowly, inexorably, Alexander's character began to change. By 328 BC, Alexander had been campaigning for 8 years. His army had marched over 20,000 miles. They'd fought in dozens of battles. They were tired, homesick, and increasingly resentful of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Alexander now wore Persian royal dress. He demanded proskynesis from all visitors. He was increasingly surrounded by Persian advisors and nobles. To the Macedonian veterans who'd followed him from Greece, it felt like betrayal. One night in Maracanda, modern Samarkand, Alexander hosted another drinking party. Among the guests was Clitus the Black, the same Clitus who'd saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus by cutting off a Persian noble's sword arm. Clitus was drunk and bitter. As the wine flowed, he began criticizing Alexander openly. He mocked Alexander's claim to be the son of Zeus. He reminded everyone that Philip II had been a greater king than Alexander would ever be. He said Alexander's victories belonged to the Macedonian army, not to one man's supposed divinity. The room went silent. No one dared speak to Alexander this way. But Alexander was also drunk, and he'd been under enormous stress for years. Instead of dismissing Clitus's words as the ramblings of a drunk old soldier, Alexander took them personally. They began shouting at each other. Friends tried to separate them. Clitus was dragged out of the room, but he broke free and came back, still shouting insults. Alexander grabbed a spear from one of his guards and hurled it. The spear caught Clitus in the chest. He collapsed, blood spreading across the floor, and died within moments. The room froze in horror. Alexander stared at what he'd done. He'd murdered his friend, his savior, in a drunken rage. According to sources, Alexander's reaction was immediate and devastating. He pulled the spear from Clitus's body and tried to turn on himself, but his guards wrestled it away. He locked himself in his chamber for 3 days, refusing food and water, crying out for Clitus, and declaring himself a murderer. His commander became genuinely worried he might starve himself to death. Finally, they convinced the army's seers to declare that Clitus's death had been the will of the gods, divine punishment for Clitus's blasphemy against Alexander's divinity. This interpretation let Alexander forgive himself, but something had broken. The young king who'd shown mercy to Darius's family and wept at Darius's death was hardening into something darker. The stress of constant warfare, the isolation of absolute power, and intoxication of being worshipped as divine were taking their toll. And worse was yet to come. Shortly after Clytus's death, Alexander faced another crisis that would lead to even more bloodshed, and this time it would claim one of his most brilliant companions. It began with a minor incident. During a royal hunt, one of the young pages who attended Alexander killed a boar that Alexander had been about to spear himself. According to Macedonian custom, this was a serious breach of protocol. The king always made the first kill. Alexander ordered the page, a young man named Hermolaus, flog in front of the other pages. It was a relatively minor punishment by ancient standards, but Hermolaus was humiliated and enraged. Hermolaus began recruiting other pages into a conspiracy. Their plan was simple. When it was their turn to guard Alexander's tent at night, they would assassinate him in his sleep. The plot almost succeeded. But the night they'd chosen for the assassination, Alexander stayed up drinking until dawn. His insomnia possibly saved his life. The pages lost their nerve and tried again the next night, but by then, one of the conspirators had confessed to his lover, who reported it to authorities. The pages were arrested, tortured, and executed. But during his torture, Hermolaus made a shocking claim. He said the conspiracy had been inspired by Alexander's court historian and philosopher, Callisthenes. Callisthenes was Aristotle's nephew. He'd been traveling with Alexander's army for years, recording the campaigns for posterity. But Callisthenes had also been vocally critical of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, particularly the demand for proskynesis. He'd argued publicly that Alexander was a mortal man, not a god, and that free Greeks and Macedonians should never bow to anyone. Did Callisthenes actually encourage the pages to assassinate Alexander? The evidence is murky. What's clear is that Alexander wanted to believe he did, because killing Callisthenes sent a message to anyone else who questioned his divinity. Callisthenes was arrested. The exact manner of his death varies by source. Some say he was crucified, others that he was tortured to death, still others that he died in prison from disease after months of captivity. But die he did, and with him died any pretense that Alexander would tolerate dissent from his inner circle. Aristotle, back in Greece, never forgave Alexander for killing his nephew. The relationship between the great philosopher and his former student was severed forever, but Alexander had bigger concerns than Aristotle's feelings. He'd finally captured Bessus, the man who'd murdered Darius. Alexander had him mutilated, nose and ears cut off, and sent back to Persia for public execution. The symbolism was clear. This is what happens to those who betray the king of Asia. With Bessus dead and the eastern provinces largely subdued, Alexander made a decision that shocked his army. They were going to keep marching. Not back to Macedon, not even back to the comfortable palaces of Persia. East. Always east. Alexander wanted India. In 327 BCE, Alexander led his army across the Hindu Kush Mountains and into the Indus Valley. He was now further from Macedonia than any Greek army had ever traveled. His men had been campaigning for 10 years. They wanted to go home. But Alexander had become obsessed with reaching the ends of the earth. Ancient geography believed the world was surrounded by a great ocean, and Alexander thought that if he marched far enough east, he'd reach it. He wanted to see where the world ended. The Indians initially didn't know what to make of this foreign army. Some kingdoms submitted peacefully. Others, like the kingdom of King Porus, chose to resist. The Battle of the Audacious River in 326 BCE would prove to be one of Alexander's most difficult victories, because Porus had something Alexander had never faced before: war elephants. Imagine the scene. The monsoon rains are falling. The Audacious River is swollen and treacherous. On the far bank, Porus has assembled an army of 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 war chariots, and 200 elephants. These weren't the small African elephants we might picture. These were Indian elephants, massive creatures standing up to 11 feet tall and weighing up to 5 tons each. They were living tanks, capable of trampling infantry and terrifying horses. Alexander's cavalry horses had never seen elephants before. They panicked and refused to cross the river. So Alexander improvised. He spent weeks conducting feints, marching his army up and down the river, making noise as if preparing to cross, then returning to camp. He did this so many times that Porus's army stopped responding to the alarms. Then, one night during a thunderstorm, Alexander split his force. He left half his army at the main camp with orders to make as much noise as possible, while he personally led the other half 17 miles upriver, crossing at an unguarded ford. By the time Porus realized what had happened, Alexander was across with a substantial force. Porus had to divide his army, sending his son with a portion to stop Alexander while he held a main crossing. The battle was brutal. Alexander's infantry had to face charging war elephants, which crashed through their formations like battering rams. Wounded elephants went berserk, trampling friend and foe alike. The elephant screams, combined with the sounds of battle and the pouring rain, created a nightmarish chaos. But Alexander adapted. He ordered his light infantry to target the elephant's drivers and the elephant's eyes and trunks, their vulnerable points. His cavalry circled around, attacking from the flanks and rear. Slowly, the elephants became more of a liability to the Indians than an asset, as the panicked creatures stampeded through their own lines. Porus himself fought from elephant back with incredible bravery, refusing to surrender even when the battle was clearly lost. He was wounded by multiple arrows, but continued fighting until his elephant, also wounded, finally collapsed. Alexander's soldiers approached to take Porus prisoner. "How should Alexander treat you?" they asked. Porus, blood-soaked and defiant, gave a response that won Alexander's respect. Like a king. Alexander was so impressed by Porus's courage that he not only let him keep his kingdom but expanded it, making Porus a vassal king under Alexander's empire. The two men, according to sources, became friends. But the Battle of the Hydaspes marked a turning point, and not in the way Alexander expected. After defeating Porus, Alexander announced his intention to continue east. According to his scouts, there were richer kingdoms beyond, particularly the Nanda Empire in the Ganges Valley, which supposedly had armies of hundreds of thousands. Alexander was excited. His officers were horrified. The men were exhausted. They'd been marching and fighting for 11 years. They'd traveled over 20,000 miles through deserts, mountains, and jungles. They'd endured heat that made their armor too hot to touch, monsoons that never seemed to end, and diseases they'd never encountered before. Many men were sick. Their equipment was wearing out, and the prospect of fighting an even larger army than they'd just faced, with even more elephants, was too much. At the Hyphasis River, modern Bios River, the army simply stopped. Alexander called an assembly and gave a speech. He reminded them of all they'd accomplished. He talked about glory and conquest. He promised unimaginable riches beyond the next river. The army was silent. Then Caenis, one of Alexander's most senior commanders, stood up. He was a veteran who'd been with Alexander since the beginning. He chose his words carefully, but his message was clear. "We want to go home." Caenis spoke of men who'd left Macedonia as young soldiers and were now graying. He spoke of those who died and never seen their homeland again. He spoke of wives and children they hadn't seen in a decade. And he asked Alexander to consider that conquest without end was meaningless. At some point, they had to enjoy what they'd won. The army erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Alexander was furious. He stormed off to his tent and refused to emerge for 3 days, hoping the men would reconsider. He announced sacrifices to determine if the gods favored crossing the river, and when the omens came back negative, almost certainly manipulated, he pretended this was the reason for turning back, not the mutiny. But everyone knew the truth. For the first time in his life, Alexander had been forced to accept a limit to his ambition. He ordered 12 enormous altars built on the banks of the Hyphasis, monuments to mark the furthest extent of his conquests. Then, seething with resentment, he began the long journey back west. But Alexander wasn't done making his men suffer. Instead of taking the relatively easy route back to the lands they'd already conquered, he chose to march through the Gadrosian Desert, one of the most inhospitable places on earth. Why did Alexander choose to lead his army through the Gadrosian Desert? Ancient sources give several explanations. Some say he'd heard that no army had ever successfully crossed it, and a competitive nature couldn't resist the challenge. Others suggest it was strategic. He wanted to scout the coast for potential harbors. But some historians believe it was partly punitive, a way to punish his army for forcing him to turn back from India. Whatever the reason, it became one of the greatest disasters of Alexander's career. The Gadrosian Desert, in what's now southern Pakistan, Iran, is brutally hot and almost completely barren. There's little water, less food, and the landscape stretches endlessly in every direction. The army began the crossing in reasonable order, but conditions deteriorated rapidly. The heat was so intense that they could only march at night. Water supplies ran out. Men began dying of thirst and heat stroke. Supply wagons broke down in the sand. When pack animals died, soldiers ate them until those ran out too. Then they began eating the cavalry horses, despite Alexander's orders against it. Flash floods, rare but devastating in deserts, swept through their camps, drowning soldiers who were too weak to escape. Women and children who'd been following the army died by the hundreds. Ancient sources claim that Alexander lost more men crossing the Gadrosian desert than he'd lost in all his battles combined. Modern historians debate the numbers, but it's clear the casualties were catastrophic. Perhaps 3/4 of the army that entered the desert never made out alive. Alexander himself suffered with his men. One famous story tells of soldiers finding a tiny amount of water and bringing it to him in a helmet. Alexander took the helmet, thanked them, then poured the water into the sand in front of them, saying that if there wasn't enough for everyone, he wouldn't drink either. Whether the story is true or propaganda, it reveals how Alexander wanted to be remembered as a leader who shared his men's hardships. When the survivors finally staggered out of the desert and reached the settled lands of Persia, they looked like skeletons, burned black by the sun, starving, many of them barely able to walk. Alexander had conquered empires, but the desert had nearly destroyed him. The years 325 to 324 BC saw Alexander returning to the Persian heartland, but the empire he'd left was showing signs of strain. Many of the governors he'd appointed had grown corrupt or rebellious in his absence, assuming he'd died in India. Alexander's response was swift and brutal. He executed dozens of officials and replaced them with new appointees. But more troubling were the tensions between Macedonians and Persians in his administration. Alexander had begun implementing his vision of a unified empire. He ordered 80 of his Macedonian officers to marry Persian noble women in a mass wedding ceremony at Susa. He himself married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, adding her to his existing wife Roxana, whom he'd married in Bactria. He also began integrating Persian soldiers directly into his Macedonian military units, not as auxiliaries, but as equal partners. 30,000 young Persians had been trained in Macedonian warfare and were now being added to the phalanx. The Macedonian veterans exploded in anger. They felt betrayed. They'd conquered this empire with their blood, and now Alexander was giving Persians equal status? They'd followed him as king of Macedon, and now he dressed and acted like a Persian emperor? At Opis in 324 BCE, the simmering resentment erupted into open revolt. When Alexander announced that he was discharging the oldest veterans and sending them home with generous bonuses, the soldiers took it as an insult. He was replacing them with Persians. They shouted at Alexander, mocking him, "Go ahead and conquer the world with your father Zeus, since you don't need us anymore." This time, Alexander didn't retreat to his tent. He leaped down from the platform, personally pointed out the ringleaders, and ordered his guards to arrest them for execution. 13 men in total. The army was stunned into silence. Then Alexander delivered a blistering speech, reminding them of everything he'd done for them, all the riches he'd given them, all the victories they'd won together. He shamed them for their ingratitude. Then he announced he was done with them. He dismissed the entire assembly and locked himself in his quarters, refusing to see anyone. For 2 days, neither side budged. But the Macedonian veterans broke first. They came to Alexander's quarters, weeping, begging for forgiveness. They said they wouldn't leave until he accepted them back. Alexander emerged, tears streaming down his own face, and embraced them. He declared a massive feast of reconciliation, though his vision of integrating Macedonians and Persians would remain a source of tension. But even as Alexander tried to hold his empire together, he was about to suffer a loss that would break something fundamental in him. Hephaestion had been Alexander's closest friend since childhood. They'd studied together under Aristotle. They'd fought together in every major battle. Ancient sources suggest their relationship was romantic, comparing them to Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary lovers from the Iliad. Whether their relationship was sexual is debated by historians, but what's undeniable is that Alexander loved Hephaestion more than anyone else in the world. He'd made Hephaestion his second-in-command, given him the Persian title of Chiliarch, roughly equivalent to vizier, and trusted him absolutely. In the fall of 324 BCE, in the city of Ecbatana, Hephaestion fell ill. The symptoms suggested typhoid fever, though ancient sources blame various causes. For 7 days, Hephaestion suffered while doctors attended him. He seemed to be recovering. Then Alexander left for a day to attend athletic games. While he was gone, Hephaestion ignored his doctor's orders, ate a full meal, including roasted chicken, and drank wine, and suffered a relapse. By the time Alexander rushed back, Hephaestion was dying. He died in Alexander's arms. Alexander's reaction was apocalyptic. He lay on Hephaestion's body for an entire day, weeping, refusing to eat or drink, refusing to leave. His generals physically had to pull him away. Then he ordered Hephaestion's doctor crucified for failing to save his patient. He commanded that all horses and mules in the camp have their manes cut in mourning, a Persian custom. He ordered the sacred fire of Zoroastrianism extinguished throughout the empire, a sign that the king himself had died, which no Persian could ignore. He sent messengers to the oracle of Ammonius in Egypt, asking if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. When the oracle replied that Hephaestion could be honored as a divine hero, not quite a god, but close, Alexander ordered temples built in Hephaestion's honor throughout the empire. He announced plans for a funeral monument that would cost 10,000 talents, roughly equivalent to $2 billion today. It was to be a pyramid-style structure that would dwarf anything in the Greek world. And then, as if grief had unhinged him completely, Alexander led his army on a campaign of extermination against a nearby tribe called the Caucaeans. Ancient sources say he killed every male and sacrificed them to Hephaestion's ghost, calling it a funeral offering. It was mass murder dressed as mourning. Alexander returned to Babylon in the spring of 323 BC, his grief still raw, his behavior increasingly erratic. He threw himself into planning new campaigns, an invasion of Arabia, possibly expeditions to the western Mediterranean and beyond. But he would never lead another army, because in Babylon, death was waiting for Alexander too. The circumstances of Alexander's death remain one of history's great unsolved mysteries. It began at a banquet in late May or early June of 323 BCE. Alexander was drinking. He'd always been a heavy drinker, but after Hephaestion's death, his drinking had intensified. During the feast, he suddenly cried out in pain, as if he'd been stabbed. He managed to walk back to his quarters, but the pain continued. Over the next several days, he developed a fever. At first, it didn't seem serious. Alexander continued conducting business, receiving reports, and making plans for the Arabian campaign. But the fever worsened. He began having difficulty speaking. His body weakened rapidly. Within 10 days, he could no longer move. Within 12 days, he was dead. He was 32 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as fever, possibly malaria or typhoid. But almost immediately, rumors began circulating that Alexander had been poisoned. The evidence for poison is circumstantial but intriguing. First, the sudden onset of symptoms at a feast, the classic scenario for poisoning. Second, Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, had recently been threatened with removal. Antipater's son Cassander was at Babylon and reportedly had confrontations with Alexander. They had motive. Third, ancient sources describe symptoms consistent with certain poisons, particularly the mention of Alexander crying out as if stabbed, suggesting sudden, sharp pain. Fourth, Alexander's body reportedly didn't decompose for 6 days after death, which some ancient writers claimed was proof of poisoning. Modern scientists note that certain poisons can delay decomposition, but so can other factors. However, the evidence for natural causes is also strong. Malaria was endemic in Babylon, especially near the marshy areas where Alexander had been campaigning. Alexander's lifestyle, heavy drinking, constant stress, multiple wounds from battle, had taken a severe toll on his health. The timeline of the illness, nearly 2 weeks, is longer than most poisonings but consistent with diseases like typhoid or malaria complicated by other factors. Modern medical experts who've studied the ancient descriptions suggest possibilities, including typhoid fever, malaria, complications from old wounds, liver failure from alcoholism, or even West Nile virus. We'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is that on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. According to legend, as Alexander lay dying, his generals gathered around his bed. Knowing the empire was about to fracture, they asked him one crucial question: "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" Alexander's response, barely whispered, has been preserved in multiple sources. Toi kratistoi, to the strongest. Whether he actually said this or it was invented later to justify what followed, those three words perfectly captured the chaos to come. Because without a clear heir, the empire Alexander had spent 13 years building immediately began tearing itself apart. Alexander's wives were both pregnant. Roxana, his first wife, gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, shortly after Alexander's death. But an infant couldn't rule an empire. Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, was mentally disabled and couldn't effectively govern either. Alexander's generals, the Diadochi or successors, initially tried to maintain unity, but within months, they were maneuvering against each other. Within years, they were at open war. What followed were the wars of the Diadochi, 40 years of brutal conflict that would finally end the empire Alexander created. His family was systematically murdered. Roxana and Alexander IV were assassinated. Statira was killed by Roxana out of jealousy. His mother Olympias was stoned to death by soldiers. The empire fragmented into several kingdoms. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would end with Cleopatra VII, nearly 3 centuries later. Seleucus took most of the Persian territories. Antigonus and later his son Demetrius fought over Greece and Asia Minor. Cassander controlled Macedonia. None of them could replicate what Alexander had done: create a unified empire stretching from Greece to India that required a combination of military genius, political skill, religious manipulation, personal magnetism, and sheer audacity that existed only in one person. And that person was gone at 32, having conquered the known world but unable to conquer his own mortality. So why are we still talking about Alexander 23 centuries later? Why does his story continue to fascinate? Part of it is the sheer scale of his achievements. In 13 years, he conquered an area of roughly 2 million square miles. He founded more than 20 cities, many named Alexandria. He spread Greek culture across 3 continents, creating the Hellenistic Age, a fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures that would shape human civilization for centuries. The empire he created became the foundation for the Roman Empire. The cities he founded became centers of learning. The Library of Alexandria will be the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. The routes he opened connected east and west, facilitating the Silk Road trade that would shape global history. But there's something more personal in our fascination with Alexander. He represents a fundamental human fantasy. What if one person, through sheer force of will and brilliance, could reshape the entire world? Alexander believed he could do anything. He believed he was destined for greatness, possibly divinity. And for 13 years, nothing proved him wrong. Every impossible obstacle, the Granicus River, the walls of Tyre, the army at Gaugamela, the elephants at Hydaspes, he overcame. But his story is also a tragedy. The same qualities that made him great, his ambition, his inability to accept limits, his need for constant validation, ultimately isolated him from everyone he loved. He murdered friends in drunken rages. He demanded worship. He drove men who adored him to mutiny. And in the end, all his conquests meant nothing. He died young, without heirs, and his empire died with him. Modern historians debate Alexander's morality. Was he a visionary who tried to unite humanity under a multicultural empire? Or was he a narcissistic conqueror who left a trail of corpses and destroyed civilizations across 3 continents? The answer is probably both. Alexander was brilliant and terrible, generous and ruthless, a military genius and a paranoid drunk. He was, in other words, deeply human, which is perhaps why his story endures. Every age reimagines Alexander according to its own values. Medieval Christians saw him as a model of chivalry. Enlightenment thinkers emphasized the spread of Greek learning. Colonizers justified their own imperialism by comparing themselves to him. Modern scholars examine him through lenses of gender, sexuality, and post-colonial critique. But beneath all these interpretations, the basic facts remain. A young man from a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world somehow conquered an empire that stretched from the Balkans to Pakistan. And he did it before dying at an age when most people today are still figuring out their careers. So what do you think? Was Alexander's conquest of the known world worth the cost in human lives? Could his multicultural empire have survived if he'd lived longer, or was it doomed from the start? And here's the question that haunts historians. What would Alexander have done next if he'd lived? He'd already conquered Persia and reached India. Ancient sources suggest he was planning expeditions to Arabia and possibly westward to Carthage and Rome. Some writers claim he wanted to circumnavigate Africa. With Alexander's ambition, who knows what he might have attempted? But perhaps the most haunting question is personal. What happens to a human being who achieves everything by age 32? Alexander had conquered the known world. Where do you go from there? What's left when you've done the impossible before you're old enough to understand wisdom? Maybe that's why his death at 32, while tragic, has a certain terrible logic. Alexander lived fast and burned bright. He couldn't have sustained that intensity for a normal lifespan. He was like a supernova, blazing across history, and then gone, leaving only light that we still see millennia later. If this deep dive into history fascinates you, if you're hungry for more stories about the people who shaped our world, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because history isn't just about memorizing dates. It's about understanding the real, flawed, brilliant, and sometimes terrifying humans who live these stories. Drop a comment below. Who do you want to hear about next? What historical figure's life story deserves this kind of deep examination? Your suggestions literally shape what we create. And if you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, in an age of short attention spans, you just spent 30 to 40 minutes exploring one of history's most fascinating lives with me. That's worth celebrating. Until next time, remember, history is not about the past. It's about understanding who we are and what we're capable of, for good and ill. Alexander proved that one person can change the world. The question is, what kind of change will you create? Subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest lives.